Today, I'm going to present to you our work on immigrant workers in green jobs. This is from a paper that the IIR will be releasing soon. First, I need to thank Kevin Nazar and Ismail Noureddini. They are the IIR graduate research assistants who did the vast majority of work and number crunching in this paper. We looked at various sources who have defined green jobs, and we used the definition from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the BLS green jobs definition contains these two components. It includes jobs that produce goods or provide services that benefit the environment, or jobs in which workers make the production of goods more environmentally friendly. Using this definition, BLS identified 19 green occupations, and then we reorganized those into 4 distinct sectors, which are listed here on this slide. First, you see building and grounds cleaning and maintenance. So this includes occupations like janitors, maids, refuse and recycling collectors. The second sector is installation, maintenance, transportation, and laborers. So this includes people like auto mechanics, bus drivers, forestry workers, wind turbine maintenance workers, and solar panel installers. The third group is supervision and business operations. And so this includes managers and supervisors of the other occupations that we have listed. And then finally, environmental protection engineers and scientists. This is the sciencey group, conservation scientists, environmental engineers, and atmospheric scientists. So you already see that it is difficult to define green jobs using census data and using government data because you look at some of these occupations, right? And I'll go back. An auto mechanic could be working on electric cars, helping the environment, but they can also be keeping older gas guzzling cars on the road for longer. Forestry workers can be planting trees, or they could be cutting down trees. So we recognize that this analysis is really imprecise and that researchers really need to work on better definitions and measurement of green jobs. But we looked at the characteristics of immigrants that were working in these 4 sectors. We looked at a lot of data, and I'm only going to share some of it with you today. First of all, we know that foreign-born are overrepresented in green jobs. Overall, immigrants make up 13% of the US population, but they make up about 17% of the US labor force, and immigrants make up 23% of workers in green jobs. Now, of course, there is a lot of variation here by sector. Foreign-born are most overrepresented in the cleaning sector, where immigrants are about 32% of all workers. And immigrants make up the smallest share of workers down there at the bottom in the science sector, where immigrants only make up about 10% of workers. Next, we looked at citizenship, and overall, about 35% of the immigrants working in green jobs are naturalized US citizens, and 65% are not US citizens. Nationally, 48% of all immigrants are naturalized citizens. So there is a larger share of non-citizens within green jobs. Not surprisingly, only about 30% of workers in the cleaning sector are naturalized citizens. And in the science sector, about 45%, or I'm sorry, in the science sector, slightly more than half, 55% are naturalized US citizens. Next, we looked at years in the United States. And overall, you see on the left side, on all green sectors, about 43% have been in the United States for more than 20 years. When you look at all 4 sectors separately, the business sector and the installation sector have been here the longest overall, with roughly about half of the workers in those sectors have been here 20 years. When you look at the science sector on the other side, that is the sector in which workers arrived in the United States most recently. So more than 30% of immigrant workers in the science sector arrived in the last 10 years. Moving on, we looked at English proficiency, and overall we found that fewer than 1/3 of immigrants in green jobs are proficient in English. And again, there is great variation over the sectors. Foreign-born workers in the science sector, on your right, are most likely to be English proficient, even though they were the most recent arrivals in the United States. We'll see that they're also the most educated. Immigrants in the cleaning sector are the least English proficient, with only about 24% of them speaking English well or very well. Next, we looked at education, and overall, we see that the foreign-born are slightly less educated than their native-born counterparts. So you look at the top two bars, and you see 77% of immigrants have less than a high school degree, compared to about 58% of the native-born. Again, lots of variation. If you look at the business and science sectors, you see that the foreign-born are quite a bit more likely to have a graduate degree and higher education. In the science sector in particular, right, you see that 64% of the foreign-born have a master's, professional, or doctoral degree, compared to only about 38% of the native-born. We also looked at BLS projections. So this was for job growth over a 10-year period. BLS looked at all projected growth in all different occupations. I've only shown the green jobs, but interestingly, the very two top of all occupations are solar installers and wind turbine technicians. And those also happen to be occupations where there's a significant number of immigrant workers. So of course, we don't know what job growth will look like now after the pandemic and the economic decline, but we expect that at some point green jobs will continue to grow. If you look here at janitors and building cleaners, we know that those people, that occupation will have to grow as we disinfect more and more buildings and clean them coming out of the pandemic. And some of those jobs we know are not the best jobs, right? They're immigrants that are making less than the native-born, they're poorly educated, they don't speak English well, and they don't have health insurance, they don't have a lot of benefits. So moving forward, as we're growing the green economy, I think that immigrant groups need to work with environmental groups and make sure that new jobs that are created in the United States and elsewhere are good jobs that have good benefits and good wages